So once again, welcome everyone to this evening's talk, a conversation with the artist Dr. Ian Allen Paul. And I'd like to say a couple words about Ian, and then to say a couple words about the piece, and then I'll hand things over to Ian. I think Ian's background is a really interesting one, and he received his MA and his MFA from the San Francisco Art Institute back in 2011, and he received his PhD in Film and Digital Media Studies from the University of California at Santa Cruz in 2016. Previously, he was an assistant professor in emerging media in the art department at Stony Brook University. But I think also, and maybe this will be part of our conversation, he's had some very interesting visiting appointments. He was a visiting lecturer at the American University in Cairo. He was also a visiting staff member at Al-Quds Bard College program at Abu Dis in Palestine. And presently, he's a research affiliate with the Feminist Media Studio at Concordia University in Montreal. The piece we're going to discuss, or put the main focus on, but I do hope that we can get to some of Ian's other pieces, is the Guantanamo Bay Museum of Art and History. The premise of the piece, you may have seen if you've gone to the link, was actually begun back in 2012. And the piece had a conceit to it that was when the Guantanamo Bay facility was officially decommissioned in 2010, an international team of artists, curators, and architects began planning, designing for a museum that would be put in place of the detention facility. And a little less than 2 years later, their work became a reality. The Guantanamo Bay Museum of Art and History, begun in 2012. Of course, unfortunately, Guantanamo Bay has not been decommissioned. It may be something for us to talk about with Ian. What does it mean for an art piece that was conceived in 2012 to continue now on to 2021? That the global war on terror is now in its 20th year, and in January, Guantanamo Bay will celebrate its 20th year of being an open facility. And it doesn't seem that at present the Biden administration is going to close it anytime soon. And of course, in the previous administration, the previous president of the United States said he was, quote unquote, fine with prosecuting American citizens charged with terrorism in military courts in Guantanamo Bay. I think, unfortunately, this work of art, this very collaborative international work of art, just as the original premise suggested and has come to fruition, and I think it has remained quite important and perhaps is even more important than maybe Ian, if I can speak for you, had ever really originally imagined. So it's with that kind of background that I'd like to hand things over to you, Ian. You can have the floor. And then we'll come back to conversation. There's some questions I'd like to ask of you. And then, like I said, we'll open the floor for the audience as well. So if everyone could give a very warm welcome to Dr. Ian Allen Paul. Ian.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jeffrey, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you so much for inviting me here virtually, of course. To talk about the Guantanamo project, and also thank you to everyone at St. Andrews for making this possible. So I wanted to kind of split my presentation or talk today into two sections. First, I wanted to briefly give an overview of the project and kind of what the Guantanamo Bay Museum of Art and History is, and talk about kind of the 10-year history of the project a bit. And then in the second half, I want to kind of give a quick overview of some of the ideas that have animated the project as a way of kind of going into the broader conversation with Jeffrey and you all today. So for the first half here, I'm actually going to pull up some images, which I think will be helpful in reviewing and kind of introducing the project. So as Jeffrey mentioned, the Guantanamo Bay Museum of Art and History was an art project that was collaboratively produced in 2012. And it's based on the premise that the prison had been decommissioned and closed and replaced by a museum that was intended to critically reflect on the history of the prison and consider kind of broader histories of carcerality and state violence going forward. It was the result of a collaboration between kind of dozens of artists and activists and writers who kind of came together to envision what a museum like this might look like. And also importantly, to actually kind of flesh it out, to produce the art that filled the museum, to produce the written texts that are hosted in kind of museum archives. We really wanted to kind of produce an institution just, you know, far beyond just that kind of the conceptual nature of it, and really act as if it was an already existing institution, really carry out the fiction to a full kind of realization. So what we're seeing here is the kind of introductory page on the museum's website. The museum's principal form is as a virtual institution, and so most people encounter it online as a website. And when you first kind of come across the museum in this way, you can see you're kind of introduced and invited to explore the museum and the different sections and materials that have been included in the project. So principally, the current exhibitions are where we host various artist projects that reflect on the history of Guantanamo. In the Center for Critical Studies, we host various kinds of critical essays and histories of the site and of incarceration more generally. In the About the Museum section, we give a kind of brief history of Guantanamo and how the prison had been closed and kind of replaced by the museum, sketching out this kind of alternative history where when Obama had signed the order to close the prison, that the prison did actually end up being closed, and tried to posit what the world would look like if that had been the case. And, you know, all these other sections of the museum as well, where you can plan a visit to the museum, where you can sign up to become a member, where you can invite us to show works from the museum in your institution, et cetera, et cetera. Beyond just the website of the museum project, it also exists in other kinds of virtual spaces. So what you're seeing here is the museum as it exists on Google Maps. And interestingly, this is actually one of the kind of most popular ways people encounter the project. So as people are kind of exploring Guantanamo Bay and Cuba more generally, you can kind of accidentally come across the museum this way. This is kind of important for us when we were initially conceiving the project, as we were thinking about how we could kind of instantiate the museum in different forms on the internet. How could we really create it as a kind of institution and have it exist virtually in all these different ways, just like, you know, museums do online, of course, as well. And so there's a way in which you can kind of collaboratively edit Google Maps to add content and sites and things like this. And so we created a bunch of fictional materials, fictional photographs, fictional documents that kind of instantiated the existence of the museum and submitted them to Google, kind of recommending that they add it to the maps. And lo and behold, you know, we were there, we popped up. And so this is, again, another way in which the museum kind of exerts its presence, and another way in which the fiction kind of extends into the reality. One of the important things that the museum does is it kind of creates all these promotional materials as a way of kind of framing the mission of the museum, and again, kind of extending the fictional nature of the project, the speculative nature of the project. We really try to use a kind of institutional aesthetics and voice as we're kind of working through the project, as a way of kind of operating and playing within the space of fiction. So here you see a series of kind of promotional posters that we've produced at various points, which have been part of exhibitions, but also just plastered on streets and things like this. Again, trying to invite more kinds of encounters with the space of kind of speculation, really trying to encourage people to imagine what it might be like to live in a world where the prison had been closed. What you see here is one of the works that we have hosted in our exhibitions on the website. It's a pair of works by the artist Jenny Odell, which are very powerful and I think speak kind of clearly to some of the kind of carceral issues that are at the center of Guantanamo Bay Prison. What you're seeing here are two kind of satellite photographs that have been extracted from Google Maps of two prisons that are in California, Centinela Federal Prison, which is a federal prison kind of near the border with Mexico, and the San Quentin Prison, which is a kind of infamous prison in the Bay Area of California. And all of the kind of contextual information, architectural information, visual information of the landscape has been removed from the images, and what's left remaining are just the actual bodies of the prisoners themselves. And so you end up with this kind of sketch of what life incarcerated looks like, kind of spatially. And you also kind of are invited to perceive life through the gaze of surveillance, through the gaze of satellite photography. On the right side of this slide in particular, you can see how the kind of traces of the prison architecture remain even though they've been removed. And so here you're seeing kind of the geometry of a basketball court in the prison, for example, where prisoners have gathered. And so this, along with other works in the museum, all reflect on kind of how detention and incarceration shape kind of global society, and really try to make connections between what's happening at Guantanamo and what's happening kind of in a much broader sense historically and culturally. As I mentioned before, beyond just the artworks, I wish I could cover all the artworks, but we don't have enough time to go through everything on the museum, so I encourage you to go to the website and check it out if you haven't yet. In addition to the exhibitions, we have the Center for Critical Studies, where we have a series of essays that critically reflect on the kind of political and ethical and juridical kind of significance of the Guantanamo Bay prison, really trying to think through its place in American culture and American politics, and importantly, kind of posit the possibility of the prison's closure, which of course is kind of central to the fiction which animates the museum itself. Beyond just existing as a fictional virtual institution, it exists as a fictional kind of installation in physical spaces. And so the Guantanamo Bay Museum of Art and History has been installed in various galleries and universities and museums around the world. Here you're seeing the museum as it's been installed in Liverpool. And so we kind of install the artworks. We kind of released press statements saying that the museum has relocated its collection to these different institutions, and then kind of staged these encounters through these physical installations. Here is another form of the installation as it was installed at the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts in San Francisco. On the left-hand side, you're seeing a kind of history of the prison articulated in the wall text, and on the right, you're seeing some of those promotional posters we produced and invited people to actually take with them from the exhibition space, so we could get the fiction kind of spread throughout the walls and domestic spaces of the city. And here you see it at UC San Diego, where we were invited to show the museum's work and kind of stage an elaboration of the fiction. As part of these exhibitions and events, typically we also host these kind of curator talks where I give lectures and presentations as one of the central curators of the institution. And so here you see me sitting there with another artist, Ricardo Dominguez, as we're kind of talking about the museum and going through its history and going through some of the works that we posted as part of the project. As we kind of move through the world and encounter different kinds of museums and academic institutions, we always try to use that as an opportunity to extend upon the fiction that animates the project. And so, for example, when we showed at Haverford College, we kind of elaborated on the project and produced a kind of whole library in the exhibition space, where we kind of reconstructed all of the books that are banned at Guantanamo and created a library where you could go and kind of read and peruse the books that are not allowed in the Guantanamo Bay Prison Library. So this is one way in which the fiction and the institution kind of grow as a result of these collaborations. But we also stage kind of more explicitly fictional events or encounters. So for example, when we hosted our exhibition at UC San Diego, we used the opportunity to announce the foundation of a new center for kind of critical abolition studies. And so here you can see we kind of placed a huge kind of construction banner on already existing construction on the campus, kind of describing this new academic archive, library, and center, which would basically research and study the relationships between the UC system in California and the prison system. And it was named after Adnan Farhan Abdul Latif, who tragically committed suicide in Guantanamo after being imprisoned there for 10 years. And one of the things that we find really crucial or essential to the project is really trying to kind of pierce reality when we do these kinds of installations, really try to intervene in the mechanisms of kind of incarceration and detention wherever we find them in the diverse forms that take place within. So for example, we showed it at UC San Diego, but also at UC Berkeley. And we used both of these opportunities to kind of reconsider the university's role in particular in the war on terror and in Guantanamo in particular. When we showed it at UC Berkeley, John Yoo, a famous law professor who continues to teach there, who was the architect of the torture memo during the Bush administration. So he kind of created the legal justification for the use of torture and kind of extrajudicial detention that characterizes Guantanamo. We use that as an opportunity to kind of expose these connections and kind of perform a kind of institutional critique within the space of the museum fiction. So I hope we have more of an opportunity to discuss the particularities of the museum itself and some of the different ways that it's operated. But I also wanted to take a brief moment to kind of describe some of the philosophy and theory which has kind of driven the project and some of the activism behind it. So as I was preparing for this talk today, one of the things that I really tried to focus on was the historical significance of the Guantanamo Bay prison. So really thinking about what it meant to approach the prison anew kind of on its 20th anniversary. So the museum has now been going on for about 10 years. And of course that coincides with the 20th anniversary, which is coming up in January. In particular, kind of thinking at the intersection of this anniversary, it seemed like a good opportunity to move beyond simply thinking about Guantanamo as an isolated or as a kind of extraordinary instance of injustice. And instead think about Guantanamo as being situated at a kind of juncture of possibility. So thinking about how did Guantanamo Bay come to be in the first place? How did we arrive in a world where something like Guantanamo Bay was possible? One of the reasons that I think this is important, and kind of refusing to think about Guantanamo as a kind of aberration and instead thinking of it as really central to our political and economic systems, is that it really changes the way that we think about how we might approach it as artists or as lawyers or as writers or as all the people that are involved in trying to close the prison. So the collective trauma of September 11th certainly created a kind of cultural and political context in which the war on terror and the Guantanamo Bay prison emerged, and also a context within which the prison could kind of be imagined and also kind of popularly desired, and of course also justified in that moment. Central to that imagination, I think, and it's kind of crucial for thinking about how the prison operates, is this idea that the torture and the extraordinary rendition and the forms of kind of targeted assassination and mass surveillance, all of these things that are involved and kind of bound up in the war on terror and in the Guantanamo Bay prison, that they don't define Western societies, right? This idea that this isn't who we are, or this isn't what we do, this is not done in our name, but rather that all of these measures and all of these policies and actions were only taken up exceptionally as a means of kind of defending us, right? Like that this was a kind of necessary measure, an unfortunate measure, but nonetheless something that was not constitutive of kind of our societies or our politics or our kind of nationalisms. This foundational imagination of a kind of threatened nation, a nation that's fundamentally vulnerable and under threat, became coupled with the kind of imagination of a hostile world, right? This world that always threatened to impinge or invade or threaten the safety of the nation. And so there's a way in which we can think about the war on terror and the Guantanamo Bay prison itself as being premised on this kind of imagination, right? As being premised on a kind of policing of cultural borders, of political borders, and of aesthetic borders. In this way, the prison and the war on terror more generally didn't just remake kind of law and policy following September 11th, but I would argue that they kind of radically shifted the way we perceive our own lives in relation to the world they inhabit. So if we think about the prison and the war on terror as being involved in kind of remaking our perception, and the ways in which this remaking of our perception come to substitute politics more broadly, that we kind of lose the ability to see the world as it could be any other way. In this crucial sense, one way of beginning to understand the historical significance of the prison itself would be to understand how it attempted and often successfully was able to police our political imagination, kind of rewriting the boundaries of what we felt was possible and impossible in that moment. One form of policing that this took shape within was a kind of drawing of the line between the normal and the exceptional. So it really kind of posited Guantanamo Bay Prison as a particularly egregious violation of an otherwise kind of just and defensible system. This kind of policing of our imagination encouraged us to see Guantanamo as an aberration or as a deviation away from kind of an otherwise sacred kind of political or legal norm, and thus kind of allowed us to look away at the same time from the massive incarceration, detention, and deportation that has long been at the heart of Western society. This line between the normal and the exceptional kind of extends to different areas as well. So this same line is kind of drawn between the legal and the illegal, between the loyal citizen and the enemy combatant, between the sensible and the insensible more generally. And all of these divisions, of course, have been really central to the ways that kind of colonial and capitalist forms of violence operate, and of course, have been really central to the way in which the war on terror has acted in the world. In this sense, the kind of terrorist, which is the kind of dominant figure, imagined figure within the war on terror, was simply the kind of latest figure of a national enemy, which has animated Western politics and Western culture more generally, which of course has taken many different forms, such as the homosexual or the savage or the immigrant or the slave at different points, depending on kind of how the nation was articulating itself into kind of hostile others, right? Another form of the policing of the imagination is the way that the prison itself kind of draws a line between the possible and the impossible, or another way of framing it would be that it draws a line between what we consider to be reality on one hand and fiction on the other. So this delineation between what is possible and impossible, or what is real or fictive, of course, is central to the Guantanamo Bay Museum project more generally, but I think it's also central to the politics of the Guantanamo Bay prison as well. One of the ways that this really kind of plays out historically is that we really come to popularly imagine the history of the prison as being the only possible history, right? As being the only way things could have gone after September 11th. And thus also we come to imagine the prison itself as being the only possible future, as being the only thing that will exist going forward. In both of these ways, the prison kind of is understood to be inevitable, right? Even if it's kind of understood with a degree of shame or regret in the kind of popular imagination, nonetheless, this kind of policing of the imagination forecloses upon our ability to conceive of any other possible world or any other kind of possible past or future. The idea that September 11th necessarily led to the construction of the prison itself and the war on terror more generally, of course, as if these things were kind of constructed like dominoes, right? As if there's like a direct kind of causal link between these things, is the central fiction that has kind of constructed our reality today, that continues to kind of sustain the prison in its present form, and that broadly continues to remake our world when we think of the policing of Black bodies, the policing of migrant bodies, which obviously is incredibly pervasive beyond Guantanamo Bay itself. So if this is how we understand the prison as kind of operating as this policing of the imagination, political, aesthetic, and otherwise, how might art respond, right? This is the question. Like once we kind of draw a picture of power what room is left for resistance in this way, right? One thing that I think projects like the Guantanamo Bay Museum try to achieve is really kind of asserting and defending the power of the imagination, right? Both kind of its centrality and how we imagine forms of political belonging, so whether along the lines of nationalism or other forms of political collectivity, but also kind of trying to highlight the ways in which imagination is really at the heart of a lot of political action, right? So just as kind of a strike in a workplace can grow more powerful as more workers are able to imagine going on strike, so too do other things grow more possible as we are able to more fully imagine them, right? So in other words, I think the central kind of question that animates the Guantanamo Bay prison and the Guantanamo Bay Museum project is this idea that if one kind of fiction could give rise to the prison itself, why couldn't another kind of fiction eventually close it, right? So really positing fiction itself as a kind of political weapon, political concept. History, after all, is not just kind of the end result of violence or domination, right? History is not just like this endless march of conquest and expansion, etc. But it also contains all these kind of forces of resistance, which are never really fully eradicated as much as power attempts to do so, right? And so resistance in that context, I think, really entails defending the imagination of different kinds of histories, and in the imagination of different kinds of histories, kind of imagining the possibility of different kinds of futures as well. Borrowing from the words of the philosopher Elizabeth Rose, one of the central tasks of resistance in this way, and of art more generally, I think, is that we really need to invest ourselves in imagining futures which are unlike the present, right? Futures that are different from the present, which I think is itself quite a radical thing to engage in. This idea that there is some kind of future and there is some kind of reservoir of resistance in the past, which can allow us to transform kind of what dominates us in the present, what dominates and practices forms of violence in the present. And so one way I think that we can approach art and approach kind of questions of resistance more generally is that they can counter this kind of policing of the imagination by refusing to kind of conform to the divisions that this policing draws, right? Between the likely and the unlikely, or between the possible and the impossible, or between the real and the imaginary, right? In doing so, I think we can kind of invite ourselves to be part of a struggle where we could imagine a present, a world that we inhabit, where the Guantanamo Bay prison no longer feels as if it's inevitable, as if it's kind of integrated into the fabric of reality, where we can imagine that the closure of the prison is no longer impossible, as it so often presents itself to us as, and also that we can imagine ourselves possibly living in a world where the prison itself is no longer possible at all, where the prison itself has been rendered impossible. So in all of these ways, and as a way of kind of including my introductory remarks here, one of the central provocations of this project that we kind of brought together as a way to counter the prison is that imagination itself, we feel, kind of must be taken up as a site of political struggle, right? This idea that the political train, although it of course exists in kind of various kind of legal and political structures at the formal level of the state, that imagination itself might actually be the foundation for these kinds of transformation. And that if power has kind of weaponized imagination in a particular way, so too must art and resistance movements understand themselves as contesting this kind of popular imagination and more broadly our kind of ability to imagine a different kind of world. So I think I'll kind of wrap up there rather than continue to be a talking head for any longer. But I really look forward to talking to everyone, and I hope this was of some use.
Oh, no, Ian, thank you very much. I mean, I really appreciate the sentiment where you left us, to think about this idea of the power of fiction here, and I'm thinking of Alain Badiou's notion that believing in a great fiction is an incredibly powerful revolutionary act, because just as you put it, and as you so nicely quoted from Liz Gross, great feminist scholar, that just the idea of thinking differently is about denying then what Pierre Bourdieu says, is the political power of the common sense, right? To really think in this different way. I know back in 2015, you had told Daniel Grinberg in an interview that you thought that the whole point of this piece was to defamiliarize, disrupt the way that we think about the prison, to make the prison itself strange to understand, right? Its contingency. I think there's something really interesting there about, perhaps going back to that Heideggerian idea of the the distinction between ready to hand and present at hand, that we can really understand things better when we don't take them for granted, and we have to think of that. So I guess, is there a piece in the museum that strikes you, aside from the museum itself, which is incredible, but is there a particular piece that you feel like goes an extra step in breaking that mold and in helping us think differently about the prison, about how we got here, those kinds of questions that you animated so well in what you've just said over the past few minutes?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of the works in the museum actually play with this question in one way or another, really try to struggle with the ways in which the violence that characterizes the Guantanamo Bay prison is both, at one sense, deeply shocking and deeply upsetting on a kind of visceral level, but also deeply familiar and deeply intimate, particularly to Americans, where so much of American culture has been literally kind of utilized within the prison as a form of kind of violence and incarceration. So kind of prompted to think about one work in particular. I think, for example, Adam Harms's video piece, Performing the Torture Playlist, is really provocative and powerful in this sense. And so in that piece, it's a hour-long video loop. I encourage you all to put it on and sit through it and really kind of use it as a way to kind of contemplate some of this. But it's an hour-long montage of videos that have been downloaded from YouTube of people doing karaoke to various kinds of pop songs, right? So on the one hand, this is a kind of image and form of media that is very familiar to us now, and it's even become more familiar to us with things like TikTok and other kinds of social media, where this kind of looping and covering of popular songs, again, it's like very, very central to how we think about the way our culture operates today. But what's crucial about that piece, and what's so provocative about it, is the pop songs that he chose to select for the video was the same pop music that was used within the prison to torture inmates, right? And so for 24 hours at a time, this pop music, Britney Spears and other kind of pop figures, would be blasted at incredible volumes in these cells, right? And so there's something very perverse about this, right? This kind of weaponization of everyday culture to kind of this excruciating level, both temporally and audibly, that I think really hits the mark in terms of thinking about how these things are so deeply familiar to us, and really imagine it. I mean, I think one of the things that I'm always reminded of is the way that Deleuze thinks about this encounter with art, where he really thinks about the power of this kind of critical gesture as being invested in kind of escaping the process of recognition, right? That Deleuze really argues that most of the time in the world, we're just recognizing things, which means that we're just thinking what we've already thought about the world, right? We see a prison, we already know what a prison is, we kind of reconfirm our thought about it and we move on. We see a work of art, we already have a concept of what that work of art is, we kind of confirm it and move on. And this is a way of just inhabiting and existing in the world as it already is, right? There's no tension, there's no antagonism in that moment. And what Deleuze really is in search of and wants to encourage in this kind of critical, political, and artistic practice is that moment of encounter, where you really have to think something genuinely, right? Where you really have to reckon with what something is and then go on living with that new understanding, right? And I think for myself as an artist, as an activist, this is something I constantly try to remind myself of, simply because I think if you really are forced to think about something like Guantanamo, you have no choice but to try to dismantle it. I think that that's true. And so I think that moment of encounter is really central, and I think that's what the art tries to do as well.
And I think just as you say, I mean, this notion of disruption is so important, and I'm mindful of the time, so I want to open this up, but I think it's also interesting to recognize the duality of Guantanamo, just as you put it, right, that by allowing it to be seen as exceptional, then it hides other ubiquities, particularly the carceral society that is the United States. And you know, you and I discussed this, but I'm from Chicago, and you know, it's very interesting to see the links between torture and the Chicago Police Department and Guantanamo Bay, and the idea that Richard Zully, who had been a police detective in Chicago for 25 years, who had a horrible reputation as a torturer, then was also a lieutenant in the Navy Reserves, and he comes to actually, you know, supervise operations in Guantanamo and bring some of those torture techniques from the Chicago Police Department to Guantanamo Bay. And it's funny to think of that relationship. It's not Guantanamo Bay comes back to inform American policing of Black and brown bodies, but rather it's American or Chicago policing of Black and brown bodies that comes to inform what had happened at Guantanamo Bay. And to think of it only as exceptional means that it becomes difficult to think that there was a Black site in the city of Chicago where, at least according to Spencer Ackerman, the reporter for The Guardian, 7,000 people were disappeared into this you know, torture chamber in Chicago over a period of about 7 years. It's really quite remarkable to think about what is real and what is normal and what is exceptional. I think you bring that out really, really importantly.
Well, that's of course crucial as well, understanding the broader histories from within which things like Guantanamo and the War on Terror emerge. And I mean, a lot of my more recent work tries to draw out some of these histories, for example, the relationship between various colonial projects and policing projects in the metropolis. And so thinking about, for example, how the mugshot or the fingerprint were direct responses to kind of colonial resistance and resistance within the city itself. And so understanding that these things actually have centuries long histories, and that they develop kind of along with sovereignty and the state and these kinds of things, but not also allowing that to become kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Not understanding that these things, even though they have long histories and are spread all throughout society, are in some ways deeply unexceptional, like you're saying, that doesn't also make us blind to the forms of resistance, which also have always kind of erupted and taken place alongside this enactment of power. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, like insisting upon the coloniality of power, the continuity of Western expansion and violence and accumulation and extraction, all these things as being deeply ingrained in the kind of our history and our culture, but also understanding that those were never without friction, without resistance, without escape, all of these things.
Yeah. Let's go ahead and try to open the conversation up here. I've done a couple of things. First, please note that on the Center for Art and Politics website, there is a link to the Guantanamo Bay Museum of Art and History. There's also a link to Ian's own webpage, so you can read more about Ian and see some of his other work. I did post in the chat a link to the museum. Also, I just posted a reminder of some etiquette about raising your hand and things like that. But if anyone would like to jump into the conversation, please feel free to raise your hand at the top of your screen. If you're unfamiliar with Teams, you'll actually see a little icon with a hand up. If you click on that, I can see you. And if you prefer not to ask your question live, please feel free to drop it in the chat, and we can open up the floor here. Yes, Kieran, please.
Thanks very much. I have a couple of questions. One, I suppose, is a bit more straightforward, and I'm just wondering, whether you have been on the receiving end of any kind of opposition to the work of the museum because of the kind of the way it attempts to challenge the narrative that's been put forward about Guantanamo, and because the way that the kind of practices that you engage in. And then secondly, I'm interested in a kind of more long-winded question, I suppose. What I find most interesting is the kind of emancipatory potential and kind of resistive power that comes from not being physically rooted in a geographical location, and in comparison to obviously those who are coercively held at Guantanamo or have been held at Guantanamo. And so, yeah, thinking about the kind of emancipatory potential of virtual spaces and the internet, and obviously the museum has been around for a while now, and the internet has changed in that period. So I'm just interested to hear if you have any reflections on whether the internet or virtual spaces still have that kind of emancipatory or resistive potential. Thanks.
Yeah, so the first part of your question was about whether I've received any pushback or what the responses have been like. I can't say that I've had any strong opposition to the project. I mean, I think, obviously people have negative reactions to it if they're opposed to kind of the political kind of balances of what the project's trying to do. But I think we could kind of posit or imagine why that's the case that people haven't gone after it. I think in many cases people don't want to give more attention to projects like this, and so they prefer not to pick the fight. That's part of it. Part of it also is because I'm kind of a white male-presenting person with an American citizenship that certainly protects me from certain kinds of harassment and et cetera in a lot of places, and so that's probably also why there's been some criticism that's been avoided. Interestingly, I did find out through a lawyer that works at Guantanamo that the project is actually blocked on the military networks. So if you're kind of on military bases or you're at Guantanamo itself, you cannot access the museum. So that's something, but I was never able to quite figure out why that's the case or how that came to be. I guess one of these days I should file a Freedom of Information Act request and try to get the story. The second question is about the kind of freedom of movement as it relates to kind of emancipation, incarceration, and also kind of how that relates to digital spaces, right? I think in a way that's really central to Guantanamo, right? This kind of way in which power and the state imagine themselves as being embodiments of this kind of freedom of movement, right? This really defined the war on terror, right? And the West really imagining itself as the police that can go around the entire world, right? And they can fly into Afghanistan and grab you from your bed and put you in a prison wherever, right? Or they can fly a drone over Pakistan and bomb you at your wedding, or whatever, right? Like there's no end, there's no constraint, there's no limit on the movement of a kind of security apparatus. And then that's of course counterposed with this real kind of restriction and securitization of movement. Of course, the most extreme example being the prison or the detention camp, but of course, central to the nation state, of course, is the border, which across Europe and certainly in the United States is really central to the political project. How that relates to digital spaces, I'm someone who my political life has been shaped by the emergence of the internet. When I was young and really participating in the anti-globalization movement, a lot of that was organized digitally, and so that was a real emancipatory moment, I think, where people really saw this as a way to undo a lot of these forms of violence. And now I think we have a more nuanced understanding of what the internet is doing, and really should be more critical of that kind of understanding. I think there is a lot of emancipatory potential in these kinds of practices of hacking, whether that happens on kind of a technical level or a cultural level. These kinds of forms of intervention, which have been a part of a lot of artistic practices and political practices, but certainly, platform politics, Facebook and Twitter and TikTok and all these other things have really consumed the vast majority of what's going on online, and so that's really diminished, I think, the potential of what we think these networks can do.
Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Kieran. Rod Coover. Nice to see you, Rod.
Hello, am I on?
You,
Can you hear me? Great. Yeah, great talk. Thanks so much for organizing this and for doing this presentation. I have I live in Philadelphia, and we have an old-style prison museum called Eastern State Penitentiary, which was designed around solitude and imprisonment with the idea of curing people somehow through that. But it very much is a product of the 19th and the 19th to 20th century logic of prisons, grounded in the kind of internal psychology of the city gone wrong, of inner crime, of noir, kind of the gangster within. And there seems to be something with whether it's Abu Ghraib or Guantanamo or other kinds of detention places that we've learned about virtually that are far out there. Something very different about a 21st century concept in the imagination of fear from outside or these forces from outside and how our power extends. And I'm particularly curious, well, how we engage those two architectural models and the concept of a museum, which is sort of out of has a middle ground between that 19th century model and 21st century model, and how you are navigating that in terms of the sense of time or fluidity of information, or as you mentioned, talking about social media, which so often happens on a different kind of time frame. How you're finding to play that axis, because you seem to be exploring the space between.
Yeah, that's a really wonderful question. I don't think I've ever had a question quite like that. My first way of kind of answering that question, of course, would be to think with Foucault and, think about the history of the prison. And as you're saying, kind of thinking about the prison as a particular kind of reform, right? That the prison, of course, was initially understood as a kind of humanitarian alternative to torture and execution and these kinds of things. And so thinking about the prison as a particular kind of institution that's intended to manage the individual and produce a new kind of individual through, panoptic structures and these kinds of things, right? So yeah, that's like really central to the way in which we think about prisons, for example, in the 20th century. But then, of course, I think one of the ways to understand the war on terror and the kind of evolution that has occurred in the past 20 years is this shift from kind of sovereignty, which, is very concerned about the kind of population, and within the population, the kind of individual with their, all the disciplinary apparatuses of the school, et cetera, to security, which is really not concerned with the individual at all, which is more concerned with probability, right? Which is a very, very different thing. And so, for example, like all of the technologies of policing and carcerality in the 20th century are all about identifying the individual, tracking them biographically, understanding sex, race, address, height. The mugshot is the kind of dominant technology in this sense. To something like with Guantanamo or with the drone warfare, where you have people being arrested and detained or killed without them knowing who they are, actually. Instead, maybe their cell phone has moved in a particular way, which an algorithm has determined it evokes a particular kind of criminal potential. And so within the state, they decided that this is a possible threat that can be eliminated, even though there's no identity or individual associated with that data, right? And so this is like a huge shift in the way that states think about what they're doing globally, and the way in which prisons and camps structure. This is also maybe a way of thinking about the shift from like the prison to the camp as well. How a museum kind of relates to that, I think that's also an incredibly complex and difficult question. I think one of the things the project tries to play with very intentionally is the way in which a particular kind of institutional critique, this critique of the prison, can take the form of an institution, which is kind of a paradoxical relationship, right? There's a way in which a lot of museums that are involved in these projects of remembrance, national remembrance, are also really horrible and awful institutions, and they're kind of recuperative in nature, right? A lot of museums, for example, around slavery in the United States are really obsessed with these kind of emancipatory narratives about, aren't we so wonderful that we did away with this, right? And there's no, you know, we eradicated racial hierarchy as we eradicated slavery, thank God, or whatever, you know. So that's a space that the project tries to play in, is how an institution which is responsible for remembering these crimes also maybe becomes interpolated in kind of these larger historical projects, if that makes sense. I hope that was sensible. That was a bit scattered, but.
No, that's great. Thank you, Rod. Thank you for that. Ian, and I think it's interesting what you just commented there on, for us to also think about those shifts, you know, from Foucault and notions of disciplinary society into then discussions of securitization and security for sure, but also then thinking, you know, what are those resistances to securitization as being kind of rooted in the conversations that come from Deleuze, and thinking about control society and what the distinction between control society and disciplinary society is, and then thinking then freely, unusually breaking the sensible, breaking the distribution of the sensible, or breaking the distribution of common sense becomes in and of itself a kind of revolutionary act. I think that's very interesting. Christina, you have a question, please.
Hi, I'm my first time using Teams, so I'm a little bit unclear what I'm doing here.
Many time listener, first time caller, right?
I missed the first 15 minutes, Ian. The last whatever that I heard was really interesting. I thought it was terrific. I am very ignorant about prisons. I'm very ignorant about Guantanamo Bay, except in the most, you know, general sense that we all are. And I wanted to ask you, because you made that point about linking it into the prison system more generally, which makes perfect sense, of course. But isn't it the case that the prison system is itself very much linked into a kind of business model, that there are firms that make enormous amounts of money out of the way the prison system works? Is that correct or not?
Yeah, absolutely correct, yeah.
So how does that work with respect to Guantanamo? You may have covered all of this and I missed it, but you know.
No, I didn't cover that, and it's a good question. So I mean, thinking about prison economies, right, and kind of how that relates to something like Guantanamo. I mean, I think one of the things that I didn't quite touch upon in my talk, but of course is central to Guantanamo, and it relates to this policing of the imagination, which I mentioned before, is the way in which Guantanamo occupies this space of exception, right? This is the kind of legal basis under which something like Guantanamo exists, where, you know, there's this kind of state of exception, which is declared as, you know, the kind of legal terminology, right? And this is something that's interesting, and it is a kind of part of all kind of Western democracies, is there are always these kind of emergency provisions, which are part of various kind of constitutions, which essentially allow for laws to be suspended in times where the kind of democracy needs to be defended, right? And so it's this strange kind of internal cancellation of democracy, right? So, you know, it allows for something like the United States to say, well, we all have right to a trial, we all have a right to, you know, habeas corpus, et cetera, but in order to defend those rights, we're actually going to deny them in all these particular cases, right? And so it becomes kind of woven into the operation of prisons more generally. Now, of course, you know, Guantanamo Bay is held up as particularly exemplary in this regard, as this place of kind of legal and juridical abuse. But that also is characteristic of prisons generally, right? And I think that's kind of central to it, right? So one of the ways that connects, for example, is for example, to the notion of bail in prisons in the United States, where you're allowed to kind of offer, you know, sums of money to be released as insurance that you'll show up for trial, right? Which is a huge kind of way in which various economic classes are able to, you know, exit prison or remain incarcerated for long periods of time, right? And so even though there are these kind of expansive political rights that are declared that, you know, supposedly everyone has within the territory of the United States, there are all these ways in which those laws are kind of suspended given certain kinds of economic provisions as well. So there's a way in which there's a kind of political exception in the sense that the rights can be kind of canceled, but there are also all these economic exceptions as you're kind of raising that if you don't have access to certain kinds of law firms or even bail funds, right, that your rights are kind of voided in that case as well.
That seems fairly obvious to me that it would be like that. I'm kind of more interested. This is really a question out of ignorance. In who's making a profit out of the running of prisons, that whole thing, because they're not, the state outsources the stuff. Is that not the case? That the state outsources all kinds of services, in inverted commas, that you need for running prisons?
Yeah, that's right. So there's like a huge wave of kind of privatization, prison privatization in the United States. And also in a lot of these detention camps, of course, they're run by various security contractors. So, prisons in Afghanistan or Iraq or these dark sites also are deeply bound up in kind of corporate firms that have been enlisted to carry out these things, which also is a way of kind of evading the political oversight of the.
But that is so stunning. That just in itself, it's so vile. It actually makes you feel sick, and it seems extraordinary to me. I suppose that we're not all, out there on the battlements saying, "For God's sake, this is a really vile way of doing things."
Yeah, and just to loop it back to what we were talking about before, these kind of long histories of violence. I mean, slavery was quote unquote like abolished in the United States, but it actually wasn't abolished. There's an exception in the abolition, and the exception is that slavery is permitted in cases of incarceration, right? So
yes, exactly.
There's forced labor allowed.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, keep up the good work. What can I say? I really love that point about the politicization of the imagination, the imagination as a site of struggle. No question about it. That's definitely the case. Yeah.
Right. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Christina. No, and I think Christina's question also gets to this larger continuity, which I think goes back to the comment that you made earlier, Ian, about the imaginary, or where Christina just finished, in thinking about the policing of the imagination, which is to think of that longstanding relationship between the law particularly as superstructure, as in Marxian terms, as superstructure to the state, and the organization then of the law to police certain bodies that largely is about protecting property rights rather than necessarily about protecting social rights, and therefore who populates the prison and for what crimes. I mean, it becomes a reflection of those priorities in the law, and therefore those priorities within society more generally. I think that's very interesting for us to think about. How do we trouble that in the museum as well?
Well, that's a really foundational kind of imagination that I also didn't have a chance to touch upon, but of course is central to kind of projects that are concerned with prison abolition in the United States, for example, where there's a really deeply, there is a popular kind of critique of prisons, I think, that exists generally, but kind of behind that critique is also this kind of exception that's made kind of morally. It's like, well, prisons are horrible, except for murderers, or prisons are horrible except for, looters or particular kinds of crimes, right? And there's always this kind of underlying imagination that prisons are in some way necessary, right? This idea that somehow the problems that we encounter in society as a result of various kinds of socioeconomic difference and inequality can be solved with prisons as the institution that's responsible for doing that. And I think that's the far more radical project, is trying to critique and dismantle that understanding, which is so central to how we imagine relating to one another today.
Yeah, and maybe as we start to bring this conversation to a close, that becomes a really interesting thought, maybe connecting back to Rod's question, because in the sense of, especially Eastern State Penitentiary that Rod was citing. I mean, just the word itself, it's a penitentiary. The notion here is that those that are incarcerated in the facility could be penitent, and therefore through penitence, right, could find salvation. I mean, how do you understand the whole purpose of Guantanamo Bay, especially as a detention facility, as a torture site? I mean, is it about those bodies in the facility in the same way it's about those prisoners within the penitentiary? Is it about a larger group of bodies? Is it symbolic that gets played out on a closed set of bodies? I mean, how do you now that you've been thinking about this facility for so long, how do you understand its purpose?
I mean, for me, I've always understood it on the terms of security, which I feel is kind of involved in a deeply circular logic of justification. And it's what I worry most about in global politics, is kind of acceleration of the logic of security into all aspects of our lives. And there's a way in which security always justifies itself, right? If security prevents an attack or prevents a risk, then it has done its job, and it has successfully saved you from this kind of possible potential violence, right? And if security fails and there is some form of violence or tragedy that occurs, that's only makes apparent the need for more security, right? And I think this is central to the way prisons operate today, particularly how the war on terror operates, and it kind of ramps up the kind of institutions and structures of security in a way where it renders more and more of the population as a kind of possible threat, right? It's something I mentioned briefly earlier, right? This idea that security understands life as a threat, right? And this is like really central because it kind of imagines everyone, right, as a potential terrorist, as a potential criminal, right? And it matters little kind of what you do. It only matters the likelihood through which you will kind of commit future acts, which is, you know, determined by probability and algorithms, et cetera. And so when we see the prison architecture, you know, creeping into cities in the form of automated cameras and turnstiles and metros, and, you know, all these forms in which kind of you're treated as a criminal in everyday spaces of life, and online this is very present as well, of course. There's a way in which it kind of it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It kind of magnifies itself and kind of follows the logic of cybernetics, right? This idea that inputs and outputs kind of feed back upon themselves over time, right?
So as we kind of draw this to a conclusion, then, at least for this evening's conversation, seeing the museum as this site of resistance, as this place of potentiality, as this place for renewed imagination, do you see other places popping up? I mean, do you see other, especially as with your comment, which I so appreciate, the way that even TikTok itself kind of closes a kind of imaginary space rather than perhaps necessarily opening it. Do you see then other spaces that we can be hopeful and I don't know, energized by, that there are, just as you said, you know, more and more people being able to imagine this, they will step forward and participate in creating these new possibilities?
Yeah, it's an important and obviously very difficult question. I mean, I think the pandemic has reshaped everything, of course. I mean, I think one of the ways, or one of the things that gives me hope in this moment are the ways in which there have been kind of popular responses to the pandemic organized around, for example, forms of care and solidarity at the level of the city or the neighborhood and all parts of the world, right? There's a way in which the pandemic in particular, as it's kind of entangled with all these processes of securitization and other things, really kind of created a space where it was just kind of the individual on one side and the state on the other, right? And the state told you to do things, and you were either kind of, you know, a good citizen and you followed the rules, or you were some defiant rebel kind of opposing the state. And it felt like that was a huge collapse of the political imagination, of the political space. This understanding that it's not just the lonely individual who is responsible or not, and the state directing people what to do, but rather there's this always emancipatory possibility of people coming together collectively and reorganizing the world in new ways, right? You know, the George Floyd protests, which broke out in New York in the early kind of period of the pandemic, was one of these moments, I think, where there's this kind of profound act of police violence, and people kind of poured out into the streets and found ways of kind of opposing this form of violence, even with all the risks of the pandemic, right? So understanding kind of how we care for each other and how we oppose systems of violence in a way that's just not reducible to being a family or an individual, and not, you know, being a citizen of the state. I think that is the space that needs to be defended now.
Well, Ian, Alan, Paul, thank you so very, very much for this evening. Really interesting ideas, and you know, just the way that you have created spaces of possibility and brought artists together who are also thinking about forms of resistance this way. I think it does give us, you know, insight into that emancipatory potential that you just mentioned, and makes it very real. And I think I look forward to seeing more works from you, and I look forward to continuing this conversation as well into the future.
How do we get to applaud?
Oh, thank you. That's a very good. I hope
really, that's really good.
Oh. Yes, there's a little icon there, as Kieran just clicked.
Oh, is there? Is there? Oh, good. Okay.
So as I mentioned, if you'd like to see Ian's website, there's a link on the Center for Art and Politics page. There's also a link to the Guantanamo Museum of Art and History there as well. And do look out on the Center for Art and Politics webpage. There'll be more discussions, and there's a great deal more programming that will happen into the spring. So I hope to see you all at the next event. And thank you very much. And please let people know that there is a recording of this event available on the Center for Art and Politics webpage. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was wonderful.